We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 118a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the Brisa, which was brought earlier, which brings various opinions of Tanoim in terms of the Mishkan when it was in Gilgal, what kinds of karbonos were brought on private bamos, and what kinds of karbonos were brought on the Bama Gedola, the main Bama that was in Gilgal. And in that Brisa, there was a Machlukas Tanoim between the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda, whether a Yachid, whether an individual brings chovos, brings obligatory karbonos on the Bama Gedola, on the communal Bama. And the Gemara now continues and says, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Loch, Rabbi Yehuda will say to you, he will respond to the Chachamim. Rashi explains, Rabbi Yehuda da Amar, Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says that Yachid Nami Makriv Chovos Begedola. He says that an individual also brings chovos, brings obligatory karbonos on the Bama Gedola. The Chachamim say that the Yachid does not do so, rather it's only the community that brings chovos on the Bama Gedola. So Rabbi Yehuda, who says the Yachid also brings chovos on the Bama Gedola, Amar Lach, he'll say to you, Ki Ksiv HaYosher, when it says in the Pasuk HaYosher, D'Memayit Yachid Mehakravas Chovos, which says that a Yachid does not bring obligatory karbonos, A Be'enov Ksiv, that's going on the word Be'enov, meaning to say that's going specifically on Bama Ketana. As the Gemara now continues, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lach, Rabbi Yehuda will say to you, Ki Ksiv HaYosher, when it says HaYosher, which indicates voluntary karbonos, A Be'enov Hu D'Chsiv, that's going on Be'enov, which is referring to a location which is fit in his eyes, which is referring again to Bama Ketana. Avol B'Bama Gedola, but when it comes to Bama Gedola, Afilu Chovos Nami Likrav, then the individual can even bring obligatory karbonos. It is only on Bama Ketana where he cannot bring obligatory karbonos. But the Gemara continues and asks on Rabbi Yehuda, Elo haksiv ish, but doesn't it say the word ish in the pasuk? And lav lememra, isn't that to say the ish yesharos or the likrav that an individual only brings during this time of heter abamos and Gilgal? He only brings yesharos, he only brings voluntary karbonos, hachovos lo likrav, but he does not bring any obligatory karbonos. Isn't that the meaning of the pasuk? And Rashi explains, Elo Rabbi Yehuda haksiv ish. According to Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't it say ish? Ve'ilav lemuute afmi bama gedola asa, if not for excluding even by Bama Gedola, the Yachid bringing obligatory karbonos. Lama li dechsev ish, why does it have to say the word ish? Nichtov kol hayasher be'enav, it should just write kol hayasher be'enav, v'kevan de be'enav, hainu ketana. Once we're saying the word be'enav indicates Bama Ketana, pshita de ish hu de mimit, so it's obvious we're excluding an ish. Dahat tzibor lo mekarviba, because the tzibor doesn't bring anything on Bama Ketana, and so again, doesn't the word ish indicate against Rabbi Yehuda? And the Gemara continues and answers, Kiksiv ish. Why does it say the word ish in the pasuk? That's lahachsher es azor. That's to allow a zor, a non-kohen, to bring offerings on the Bama Ketana. The Gemara asks, zor, if it's to permit a non-kohen, mi v'zorak ha-kohen es adam al mizbach Hashem nafka. Isn't that learned out from a different pasuk? It's learned out from this pasuk of v'zorak ha-kohen. And the Gemara says, no, ma'u detema, what might you have said? Liboy kiddush bechoros. Maybe we require sanctification of the firstborn. Maybe there's a firstborn requirement, kimei ikara, like it was originally at the times of the Mishkan in the Midbar. And so Kamash Malon, that's what the pasuk is teaching from ish. It doesn't have to be a Bechor. Even any non-Kohen is able to bring on a Bama Ketana. Rashi explains, Lahachsher es hazor, to permit a Zor la'avodas Bama, to do the Avodah on the Bama. Zor mi v'zorak ha-Kohen nafkal, and don't we learn Zor from v'zorak ha-Kohen l'kamon bepirkin, that's later on in our Perek. Techsiv v'zorak ha-Kohen es adam al mizbach Hashem, Pesach o al moed, and it means Kohen, Pesach o al moed, ve'in Kohen b'Bama. There's a rule of Kohen by Pesach o al moed, but not by Bama. Ela afilu Zor, even a Zor is permitted, va'afilu Eved, and even an Eved is permitted. Hachi darish le b'Torahs Kohanim. This is how it's darshaned in Torahs Kohanim. And the Gemara continues and asks, Chachamim hainu Tanakama, aren't the Chachamim the same as the Tanakama in the Brisa? And the Gemara answers, Amar Rapapa says, Kirvu Nesachim b'midbar ika beinayu, the difference between them is whether Nesachim, whether libations were offered in the Midbar. And Rashi explains, Chachamim hainu Tanakama, aren't the Chachamim the same as the Tanakama? Meaning Rabbonan Basroi, hainu Rabbonan Kamoi, there are two Rabbonans in the Brisa, so the latter Rabbonan are the same as the earlier Rabbonan. Toha'inu nami hachi amri, they say the exact same thing. The Yachid lo kervu ella olos u'shlamim, that an individual only brings olos and shlamim. V'tzibor karvi nami chovos, and a community is able to bring chovos as well. Tohame ish nafkal hu miuta, because they learn the exclusion from ish. And Rashi continues, Kirvu nesachim b'midbar ika beinayu, the difference between them is whether nesachim, whether libations were offered in the midbar. L'rabbanan kamoy, according to the first Rabbanan in the Brisa, lo kirvu nesachim b'midbar, nesachim were not brought in the midbar. V'olo u'shlamim grade below nesachim kagamri de karvi b'bama de v'midbar lo karvi, it's only Ola and Shlamim without Nesachim that were offered at the Bama Gedola in the Midbar. The Chisavo, the Pasuk in Chisavo, the Parshas Nesachim, which is about Nesachim libations, Lahatino Nesachim b'Mishkan Shiloh asa. That Parsha is simply saying that Nesachim are required in Mishkan Shiloh, La'achar Yerusha v'Yeshiva, after they inherited, they settled the land, Keda'amrin b'Hashochet, like we said in Hashochet earlier, and so therefore that Pasuk is only requiring Nesachim later in time, at the time of Shiloh, and not in the Midbar. That's the opinion of the Rabbanan Kamoy. The Rabbanan Basroi, now the Rabbanan Basroi, the latter Rabbanan in the Brisa, L'tafuye also, they're coming to add on beyond the Rabbanan Kamoy. Miditanan Mishnah Yisera, because there's an extra line over there in the Rabbanan Basroi. It says, Kol Shahat Sibur Makriven B'Yoel Moed Sheba Midbar, anything that the community would bring in the Yoel Moed in the Midbar, Makriven Begilgol, they would offer the same types of karbonos in Gilgol. Lamaluhu Lemisni, what do they have to have that line for? Rabbi Yehuda Nami B'Tzibor Kivasayu Kam. Rabbi Yehuda agreed with the Rabbanan Basroi in terms of the Tzibor, in terms of the community. There was only a disagreement by the Yachid. V'hachi Boiluhu Lemeimar, they should have said as follows: Kan v'kan, here and here, whether the communal, whether the private bama, lo kirvu liyachid ella ola ushlamim. The individual only brings ola ushlamim. They didn't have to have the line about the tzibor. And so why do they have that line about the tzibor? Ella litafuye ad rabbanan kamoy asu. Rather, the Rabbanan Basroi, they're coming to add on. They're also arguing and adding on the Rabbanan Kamoy, the earlier Rabbanan. V'yamri, and they're saying kol shat tzibor tzrichin lahakriv makriven bi'ol moed sheba midbar makriven bi'ol moed sheba gilgol. Anything that the tzibor is bringing in the midbar, they bring in Gilgol. Uletafuye nesachim also, and they're coming to add on libations. That's the point of disagreement. Ulameimer, and to say the kirvu b'midbar letzibor ulayachid, that those were brought in the midbar for the tzibor, for the yachid v'chein begilgol, and the same is true by Gilgol l'shtei habamus. Ulamandi islay kirvu b'midbar. Now the one who holds this was offered in the midbar. Islay the kirvu b'bamas yachid begilgol would also say that it was offered on a private bum in Gilgol. The chisavo lo asa el lahatino nesachim lebama ketana. The parsha of Kisavo is coming to say nesachim are required by bama ketana. The habegedola kvar hayu craven, because by the bama gedola they already were offered. We already knew about that, and so we're even adding on the private bama, the requirement of nesachim. And again, that's going to be the dispute. This dispute about nesachim is the dispute between the Rabbanan Kamoy and the Rabbanan Basroi. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Mar, the master said, this is from the Brisa earlier, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, again, Rabbi Shimon said that by the Bama Gedola of Gilgol, the only karbonos that were brought, that were not also brought by Bamas Yachid, were Psachim, that's Karban Pesach, and Chovos HaKavua Lahem Zman, Chovos, obligatory karbonos with a fixed time. And the Gemara says, my time at Rabbi Shimon, what's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Techsiv, because it's written in the Pasuk, V'yasu b'nei Yisrael as HaPesach b'Gilgol, it says that they did the Karban Pesach in Gilgol, and so Pshita isn't that obvious. Eloha Kamash Malon, rather it's teaching, Dechovos Ke'ein Pesach Hu Dekarev, only obligatory karbonos similar to Karban Pesach were offered, halav kein Pesach, but if they were not similar to Karban Pesach, lo karev, then they were not offered. And Rashi explains, Pshita, isn't it obvious to bo lemevad Pesach? Of course they have to do the Karban Pesach. Why does it even need to be written? And so again, the idea is it has to be only chovos that are similar to Karban Pesach, and again, that means chovos hakavua lehem zman. And the Gemara continues, v'idach, in the other Tana, the Tana that disagrees, the Tana that says that all obligatory communal karbonos can be brought at the Bama Gedola. So what does that Tana do with this pasuk of V'yasu b'nei Yisrael as HaPesach? Mi boi leilech Rabbi Yochanan. That pasuk is needed for the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. The Yamar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Benoah. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Benoah, Orel Mekabel Hazah. This pasuk teaches us that an Orel, that's an individual who is uncircumcised, Mekabel Hazah, he's able to be sprinkled. That's talking about the purification process of Tamei Meis. Rashi explains, Orel, you have an uncircumcised individual, Shenitma b'meis, that he's also Tamei Meis. Mekabel Hazah, he is able to be sprinkled with the Mechatos, that's the purification waters for Tomas Meis, Vitar, mi Tomas Meis, and he is then tar from Tomas Meis, Liga b'kotchim, and is able to touch kotchim. V'yolef mehachin, it's actually learned from here, from this pasuk. Techsiv v'yasu as HaPesach b'Gilgol. It says that they're going to do the Karban Pesach in Gilgol. Demashma she'asau kel chasu b'mila b'tahara. The pasuk is understood to be meaning that they were able to do it kehel chaso, they had bris milah, and they were purified. V'ruban areilam hayu. Now most of the individuals at that time were uncircumcised b'midbar, in the wilderness. Techsiv lo malu, it says that they were not circumcised. V'yaminin b'yavamas, and we say in Yavamas, ba'asara b'nisan she'avra es hayarden lo mol misham chol Shlosha de Orcha, on the 10th of Nisan, when they crossed the Yarden, they did not become circumcised because of their weakness from traveling. Ella b'chad sari, who rather was just on the 11th demol that they were circumcised. V'shtakach the Tmei Mesim shahayu bahem, sharei Ruben Tmei Mesim. Now it would turn out that those who were Tamei Mes among them, and most of them were Tamei Mes, most of them were Tamei Mes, shemesu avoseyim kol arboim shana b'midbar, because their fathers had died for 40 years in the wilderness, v'nitmu bahem, and they became Tamei through them. V'im lo kiblu hazav v'nitaru ba'arlusan, if they were not receiving the sprinkling of purification while they were uncircumcised, so ein lahem shos lahazos mishamolo, they would not have time to be sprinkled after getting circumcised. Datzarach lahafresh shlosha yamim bein hazah lahazah, there has to be a separation of 3 days between the sprinklings. Revi chamishi v'shishi, again the gap of the 4th, 5th, and 6th day. V'kan ilohizu ad yom achad asar b'nisan hazah rishona, here if they're not going to be sprinkled until the 11th of Nisan, which is the hazah rishona la'achar shemolu, meaning waiting after they had bris milah, sulo matiz man hazah shniya, so then the second sprinkling is not going to arrive ad yom chamisha asar, until the 15th, and so therefore you see it must be they were able to be sprinkled when they were arelim, when they were uncircumcised. Uvi Yavamas isay lahad Rabbi Yochanan bePerek Ha'arel, in Yavamas we find the statement of Rabbi Yochanan in Perek Ha'arel. And the Gemara continues, Tani Tana Kami de Ravada Barava, Tana taught before Ravada Barava, Ein Bein Bama Gedola Levama Katana, there's no difference between the Bama Gedola and the Bama Katana, Ela Pesach, except for Karban Pesach, the Chovos HaKavua Lehen Zman, and obligatory Karbanos, which have a fixed time. Amar Lei, so he said back to him, Ravada Barava responded, to Targim Masnisach, this brisa that you are teaching right now, you have to interpret it, Ba'olas Chova, that it's talking about a Karban Ola that's obligatory, Di'ika olas nadava, because there you have an olas nadava to contrast. And Rashi explains, Utetargim, you should interpret masnisach, your brisa, to katani, because what does the brisa say? It says, Chovos hakavu lahem zman karva begadola. It says that Chovos hakavu lahem zman, those were brought on the big bama. So that's talking ba'ola, it's talking about ola. The brisa is making a contrast and saying the ola, which are the olos, which are obligatory, they're brought on the bama gadola. And what are those? Kagon olos shel tamidinu musaf and sibor, like for example, the Talmud, the Karban Talmud, and the Karban Musaf of the community, Kervuba, those were offered on the Bama Gedola. That's what the Bryce is saying. Aval Chatos hakavu alehem zman, but let's say the Karban Chatos, which have a fixed time. Kagon seirei haragolim shel tzibor, for example, the he-goats of the holidays of the community, lo Kervuba, you have to say that those were not offered on the Bama Gedola. That's how you have to interpret this Bryce. And the Gemara continues, the i-chatos, because if you're going to say that the Bryce is talking about a Karban Chatos, and we will go with the gears of the Shinuya Nuschos over here, if we're talking about a Chatos Nedava Mi'iko, is there such a thing as Chatos Nedava? That's the Girsa of Rashi. Rashi explains, the I Bechatos, the Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman Bechatos Nami Kamer, if when the Brisa says Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman are brought on the Bama Gedol and Gilgul, it's talking about Karban Chatos as well. Chatos Nedava Mi'iko, is there such a thing as a donated Chatos? Likarev Kayotze Ba Bekatana, because the whole point of this Brisa is to say that a similar donated carbon can be brought on Bama Katana. V'al karchach masnisim kamash malon, it has to be the Bryce is teaching us, the lo careful Rabbi Shimon begedola levad mi psachim, that according to Rabbi Shimon on the Bama Gedola, the only types of carbonos that are brought besides psachim, elachovos sheyesh kayotze bohen nedav, it has to be some kind of obligatory carbon where there's a counterpart that is voluntary, that's an adava. Ela psachim v'chovos hakavu elahem zman, that means to say psachim and chovos hakavu elahem zman. Now, if it should enter your mind that the term Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman simply means all Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman, so Psachim de Katani Lamali, what do you have to even write Psachim for? Hachi Havalei Lamemar, it should have simply said, Ein Bein Bama Gedol LeBama Katana, Ela Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman. The only difference between Bama Gedol and Bama Katana is Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman. V'Havilu Psachim Bechlal, and Psachim are included in that category of Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman. In other words, the Gemara is focusing on the fact that a Karban Pesach is a Chova HaKavu Lehem Zman. So why say both Psachim and Chovos HaKavu Lehem Zman if not to have some kind of limitation? Ela Hachikaman, rather it must be saying as follows. Ela Psachim Shekirvu Begedola, there's the Karban Pesach that's brought on Bama Gedola. V'lo Kirvu Bekatana Klal, and that's not brought on Bama Katana at all. Ushar Dvarim Shekirvu Kan V'kan, and then there are other Karbanos which are brought here and here. They're brought both by Bama Gedola and Bama Katana, except that they're Nedavos on Bama Katana. Katana, and they're obligatory on Bama Gedola. Ein chiluk bahen ela shebezulo kirvu ela nedavos. The only difference there is that on the Bama Katana it's only nedavos, it's only voluntary. Uvazu kirvu af chovos hakavu el hemzman. And when it comes to Bama Gedola, even chovos hakavu el hemzman can be brought, and so that's what Rav Ada bar Rav is saying. It has to be that the way to interpret this brisa is only talking about carbon ola. It cannot be talking about carbon chatos. The Gemara continues and asks, "V'lukma b'minchas chova." Why not say that we're talking about minchas chova? Deha chavisin, because there's the chavisin carbon of the Kohen Gadol. So you have a counterpart. You have minchas nedava that would be offered on the Bama Katana, and you have chavisin that's offered on the Bama Gedola. Maybe that also is included in the statement of the brisa. And to that the Gemara says, "Kasavar ein mincha b'bama." This Tana holds that there's no mincha at all by the Bama, and so therefore that would not be a proper contrast. And Rashi explains, "V'nukma nami b'mincha." Why not say also by mincha, the mashkachas lakan minchas nedava b'katana? Then you could say the voluntary minchas by the katana, uv'gedolo defes minchas chavitin, and then by the gedola you also have the minchas chavitin shechovas hakavu elam zman b'chol yom, that has a zman, it has a set time, and it's an obligatory every day. And the Gemara answered, kasavar Rav Ada bar Rav. Rav Ada bar Rav holds ein mincha b'bama. There is no mincha by bama, and therefore Rav Ada bar Rav did not interpret the brisa in that fashion. The Zevachim ksiv, because again it's written the word Zevachim, and so therefore Zevachim does not include carbon mincha. Rashi addresses one other possibility. Uveshalmei tzibor de'atzeres. What about shlamim? Maybe we're talking about shlamim because you have a communal, obligatory shlamim, which is the shalmei tzibor of atzeres of Shavuos. Leka lo'ukma, that you cannot say is what the brisa is referring to. Mishum the shalmei bama katana lo damilu, because the shlamim brought on bama katana are not similar enough to the shalmei tzibor of atzeres. She'elu kodshei kodshim, because the shalmei tzibor of atzeres are considered in the category of kodshei kodshim, the most holy of karbanos. Ve'elu kodshim kalim, and a regular shlamim is considered kodshim kalim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Bo l'Shilo, when they came to Shiloh, so the Mishkan Shiloh, it was made of stones, but then the top, the roof, was a curtain. The Gemara says, Menohani Mili, from where do we know this? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Kasav echad v'tiviyeyu beis Hashem Shiloh. This pasuk refers to Shiloh as beis Hashem, like a house. V'chasav echad v'yitosh Mishkan Shiloh ohel, shikein ba'adam. Here it's referred to as an ohel. Uchsiv v'yimas bo el Yosef of Shevet Ephraim lo bacher. Here also it's referred to as an ohel. Ketzad haso lo haisa sham tikra. There was not a roof, so in that sense it was like an oel. Ella avonim milmatan, but there were stones below. V'yarios milmalan, and there were curtains above. V'hi haisa menucha, and that's what the pasuk is referring to when it says menucha. And so therefore, in some ways it was like a house, and in some ways it was like an ohel. And Rashi explains, Menohani mili deveis avonim lamatan v'yarios lagag. How do we know that there were stones at the walls below, and there were curtains for the roof? And again, the Gemara answered based on the psukim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Kachei Kachim, karbonos that were Kachei Kachim, during Mishkan Shiloh, they were eaten within the curtains, and Kachim Kalim could be eaten anywhere where Shiloh was visible. The Gemara says, Menahani Mili, from where do we know this? Samar Aboshir, Aboshir says, Damar Kra, because the Pasuk says, Hishamar L'cha Pentala Olosecha B'chol Mokom Asher Tira. It says, B'chol Mokom Asher Tira, anywhere where you can see. B'chol Mokom Asher Tira Iatomala, any place where you can see, you can't offer karbonos. Avalata Ochel B'chol Mokom Shatorah, but you can eat from the karbonos anywhere where you can see, and so the idea is anywhere where Mishkan Shiloh was visible, the karbonos could be eaten. The Gemara says, Eima b'chol makom shatorah iatamala. Maybe we should say the pasuk means any place where you could see Shiloh, you can't offer up karbonos. Aval atah zoveyach b'chol makom shatira, but maybe you could slaughter the animal anywhere where you can see Shiloh. And to that the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Sham ta'ala v'sham ta'asa. There you're going to offer up, and there you will perform it. And so therefore the slaughtering as well, it cannot be done anywhere where Shiloh is visible. We're referring to the eating. Rabbi Avdimi bar Chasa Amar Kra. Rabbi Avdimi bar Chasa says that the pasuk says, and Rashi explains, Hishamar L'cha. Again, we bring the pasuk of Hishamar L'cha, Mishatavo El HaMenucha Kai Kra. This pasuk is talking from when they came to the Menucha, meaning when they came to Shiloh. That's how we know it's talking about Shiloh. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amid Beis.